We're going to move on with our programs, and Dean Clapper is going to introduce the next plenary speakers. Thank you.
I'm very honored to be able to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Susan Bell Chiblow is an Anishinaabe Kwe, born and raised in the Garden River First Nation, Ontario. Dr. Chiblow is a commissioner appointed by Canada to the International Joint Commission. She is also a Veneer Scholar and an assistant professor at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph. She's worked extensively with First Nation communities for the last 30 years in environmental related fields. Her PhD in environmental science had a focus on water knowledge in communities. Chiblow has worked with the Chiefs of Ontario as the environmental coordinator of the environmental unit through her company, Ogamaanung, and she continues to work with First Nation communities and elders as an Anishinaabe advisor. Chiblow's expertise includes environmental projects, policy analysis, watershed planning, source water protection, law development, and facilitation, strategic planning, and traditional ecological knowledge and environmental management planning. And we're so honored to have her come and speak to us today. With that, I welcome our speaker. Thank you so much.
Oh, it is bright and it's cold in here. Anin bonjour, minokishep. Thank you, Dr. Clapper. I want to first acknowledge and say miigwech to Mark Denning, excuse me, for the opening address, and also to Barbara Wall for the water ceremony that she conducted. And also miigwech Windum. I'm grateful to all of the Indigenous peoples that continue to do this work and come to these important events to raise awareness of all of the important work that they are doing. Bojo Kinawa, Kinawayak, Su Chiblow Dishnakaz, Ogama Anug Indigo, Tijak Dodam, Ketagonzi Bing Dunjaba, Anishinaabe Kwe and Dao, Ketagonzi Bing Hindogam. So I introduced myself in the language with my name, my spirit name, my clan, where I am from, where I live, and who my nation is. And I do this because I have responsibilities to that, and to my ancestors, to the past, to the present, and to the future. I want to also acknowledge these lands that we are on, as when I'm a visitor to somebody else's territory, I always try to find out whose lands they are, what their responsibilities are, and what they have been doing to protect their lands. So to be respectful to these lands and to the peoples that live on these lands, I understand that these lands continue to provide for many Indigenous nations, including the Menominee, the Potawatomi, and a few others. And I think Mark said that the Oneidas are now here. They seem to be getting everywhere, those people. And the Ojibwe are all over the place too. So I'm truly honored to be here and will walk with respect and kindness and responsibilities on these lands. Now, so, oh, okay, he's going to start some slides so you can look at some pretty pictures. I also want to thank and recognize the International Association of the Great Lakes Research for hosting this important gathering year after year, and want to acknowledge everybody because I can only imagine the amount of work that goes into hosting such a big event. All right, miigwech. And for their commitment to advancing rigorous science, interdisciplinary collaboration, and dialogue that is critical to the health and the resilience of the Great Lakes. I also want to acknowledge the governor of Wisconsin yesterday for mentioning the continued health and prosperity and success of the Great Lakes relies on our behaviors towards those waters, and also to the mayor for reminding us that we need to continue to stick together. Very, very important words. So these are the lands that I'm from. I'm sure you are all aware of where the Great Lakes are. But one of the important things that with this slide is that I want to show that as Anishinaabe peoples, we have names for all of these waters. We have names for all of these different places, and that those names are still there. Yes, we now have English names for many of the different places, but remembering as part of our land acknowledgement that there were people here that were occupying these lands and living their responsibilities towards the waters. Today I want, it's kind of threefold. I want to reflect on the important role of Indigenous science in promoting resilience in the Great Lakes. And I will do so using a few different languages. So in some sense, I mean that actually literally, because I introduced myself in Ojibwe Moin, the Ojibwe language. And for Indigenous peoples and nations and communities across the globe, language is not separate from our culture, from the lands and from the waters, or from scientific and technical knowledge. And to speak of Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous science requires speaking in the Indigenous languages. And so you don't worry, I will do my best to translate what I'm actually trying to say when I use our language, because I am a language learner. I wasn't born into our language. So when I think of this word resilience, I know and understand that as Anishinaabe peoples, we have been living resilience since the beginning of time. We adapt to the seasons, to the weathers, to the different patterns that are happening. We adapt to the animal patterns, the animal behaviors, to all of these different changes. And we have welcomed and adapted to the newcomers that have arrived on our shores. We have maintained our language, culture, and science throughout this entire time. So to me, that word resilience loosely translates into obzitun, to bring back life or coming back to life. And that's what that loosely translates into. It's meaning the Anishinaabe language, our language, and I understand most Indigenous languages are very action-based. It's a verb-based language. So to do, to be, to understand, to relate, to continue, and so on. Second, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Guelph, so I'll include some academic jargon and talk about some of the publications that I've been part of, and of course, some of my research. I recently authored a chapter in the United Nations State of the World's Indigenous Peoples, Climate Crisis Volume 6 report. You can find that easily online. That's part of the whole syllabus today of what I'm going to be talking about, but I won't be doing a quiz unless you're an academic. I'll have a test for you. And I'll also end with a slide that recommends further reading for those of you who want more opportunities to learn. And then thirdly, and lastly, I will be speaking the language of the International Joint Commission, or the IJC. I was appointed by Canada in 2023, and I serve on the IJC as one of the 6 commissioners. For those of you who are less familiar with the IJC, the governments of Canada and the United States created the IJC through a 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. So we, the IJC, have been here since then, and it provides objective, science-based advice to help the countries peacefully steward the lakes and rivers that they share across the Canadian-US boundary. So not just the Great Lakes, but right across the boundary. And we play a vital role in fostering collaboration and engaging communities in stewardship of these shared waters. As A scientific advisor to governments, the IJC has a unique language as well. And later I will highlight some of the IJC's collaboration with Indigenous peoples and our priority to enhance the role of Indigenous peoples in collaborative government. So I'll resume back to my language interpretation by unpacking some of the English terminology, such as governance. So I think that, everybody is aware that Indigenous peoples were here first living on these lands. We were governing ourselves with our own laws, our own protocols, our own processes. We have our own language. And the waters were our original highways. And we have a shared responsibility between Indigenous nations. These waters provided and continue to provide life for all beings. And when we talk about that shared responsibility, because the waters were our highways, that shared responsibility was happening prior to the IJC, prior to 1909. And we also, for the Great Lakes, we have a name for those lakes, and it's called Neonano Nabi Mong Gitchigami. And this loosely translates into the 5 freshwater seas in my language, because I'm sure there are the other peoples, Indigenous nations that are in and around living in the Great Lakes or that have come here also have names for these lakes. So the Indigenous peoples understand and still understand that the waters have responsibilities, and the waters actually govern themselves. We humans are but a mere participant in their water governance structure with responsibilities to the water. As we face increasing pressures from climate crisis, demographic changes, and economic development, resilience has become a central goal in water governance. However, resilience is not only about withstanding shocks and coming back to life. Resilience is also about maintaining the relationships that sustain a healthy environment. So to achieve resilience, science and governance must be grounded in a shared goal of achieving balance among all relationships. This concept of relational balance is foundational teaching in many Indigenous worldviews. And as an advisor to Canada and the United States, the IJC plays a critical role in this shared responsibilities to the waters across the Canada-US boundary. It is through 2 international agreements that the Government of Canada and the United States have vested the IJC with governance responsibilities to help them achieve the shared goal. The 1909 Boundary Water Treaty between the US and Canada established the IJC to serve as an independent and objective advisor on issues relating to the transboundary waters. It also established the principles and mechanisms for preventing and resolving any disputes involving water quantity and quality among the 2 countries' shared border. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between Canada and the United States is an important landmark for water governance. The agreement is a commitment between the 2 countries to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the Great Lakes ecosystem. The agreement outlines 9 objectives for the Great Lakes water quality, including that the lakes are fishable, drinkable, and swimmable. The governments of Canada and the United States are responsible for implementing the agreement. And the IJC plays an important role by assessing progress and providing advice and guidance to both governments, advice informed by Indigenous peoples and by people like yourself and the general public. As part of its assessments of progress, the IJC produces a triennial assessment of progress, or commonly known as a TAP report, every 3 years. Efforts are already underway to develop the IJC's 4th TAP report, anticipated in 2026. The IJC's work under the agreement is guided by experts from our Great Lakes Water Quality Board, from the Great Lakes Science Advisory Board, and from the Health Professionals Advisory Board. Many members of those boards are in attendance at this event, many of whom are convening sessions and or giving talks. The IJC board members, I'd like you to please raise your hand because I want to acknowledge and everybody around you acknowledge and say miigwech to the important work that you do. And again, thank you to IAGLR leaders, in particularly Executive Director Jerome Marty and Board President Donna Cashian, who are both members of the IJC Great Lakes Science Advisory Board, so they're very busy people. I also encourage others to learn more about the IJC from our board members. So getting back to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, this agreement is key to Great Lakes water governance. Over the last 50 years, the agreement has catalyzed significant progress to improve water quality. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, there's a lot more work to be done. There is a growing recognition that Indigenous science and the traditional knowledge are crucial in all of the water decision-making regimes. It is incumbent upon all of us to better reflect the knowledge and science of Indigenous peoples in our collective efforts to achieve resilience and restore balance within the Great Lakes. So for Anishinaabe, when we talk about balance among relations, we use a concept or an understanding, and it's referred to as Minobamadzwin. And this is about living the good life, living in balance and harmony. And to achieve this, we have Gikendaswin Min. Among the Anishinaabe, the health of the ecosystem has been preserved through practicing and living Gikendaswin, which is learning from the lands, the waters, and the sky world, acquiring a lived knowledge, lived experiences. Gikendaswin Min means our knowledge, and the base word in there is Kendaswin, which is knowledge. And so this Gikendaswin Min rationalizes that water is life. We all need water. All beings need water. And to truly understand this means understanding that we humans are a part of the water cycle. We're not above it. We're not outside of it. We consume water. We need water. And that we all come from water. No matter our shape, our size, our color, our likes and our dislikes, our cultural beliefs, we all came from that water lodge. We all sat in that water lodge developing in water before we came into entering this world. So every single one of us comes from the water. And I think it's always important for me to mention that there is women's knowledge. Typically, when we are doing research projects, in many instances, we're looking for the men who fish, which is great. But when those fish come to shore, it's typically the women who are cleaning the fish. So they see what's inside the fish. They know what's happening inside that fish. So there's that balance again that we need. And right now, typically, we do not see a lot of women's knowledge inside government legislation and or policies. And when women are the only ones that can actually carry that water lodge if they so choose to do so. So the Anishinaabe understand that there are 4 types of water. Some people say 7, but we'll start with 4 today. And there are the salt waters, the fresh waters, the rain waters, and women's water. And the reason why I mention this is because when we look at those water cycles, we take ourselves as humans outside of that. But it is important to remember that we need to be we are a part of that water cycle, and that having women sitting at the table with their knowledge is also about protecting, when we talk about protecting knowledge, water, and just creating balance and resiliency, it's also about protecting women's knowledge. So it's about protecting the women. And to achieve resilience and restoring balance, we need to maintain and build relationships that are driven by respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. In the session yesterday that I was part of, Advancing Resilience through Braiding Knowledges in Indigenous-led Research, we talked about this word respect. And in my language, manaden di moin is the word for that. And that actually translates loosely into Michael Rice, a language speaker who also is with GLIFWIC, the Great Lakes Fisheries Indian Commission, was explaining that it actually doesn't mean respect. It means to go easy on one another. So imagine us going easy on one another and doing that work together, like the mayor reminded us that we need to stick together to do this work. So at this, I think that when, we look at, well, what is Indigenous knowledges and how does that contribute to our understanding of water decision-making, all of these different decision-making tools that we have put in place. And this is an image from a scientific journal, that article that they actually give you a demonstration and they explain on how all of Indigenous knowledge contributes to the understandings of these different processes. And I teach 2 classes at the University of Guelph in a program called the Bachelor's of Science and Indigenous Knowledge program, Indigenous Practice program. And it takes me 2 classes, so 2 months to teach what Indigenous science actually is. So I'm going to try and relay that to you in a couple minutes here. I think that one of the most important things to understand is that Indigenous knowledge systems that are commonly known as TEK are place-based. So that pretty much means that I have knowledge from the connections of the lands that I live on. I do not have knowledge from the desert or the jungle. I would totally have to rely on somebody else to be in those territories. So it is this place-based knowledge. And I think it's also important that when we think about Indigenous knowledges and we think about water and how do we work with Indigenous knowledge, and understanding that, Indigenous knowledges know the flows of the waters. They know who lives in the water. They know the behavior of the water and the interconnectedness of the water. And they have a very deep understanding of balance. So living responsibilities to these waters. In Indigenous science and practice, a lot of scholars have written about this. So you can type in Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge into a search engine of your choice, and it'll come up with all types of definitions. And also it'll come up with possible ways on how to work with Indigenous science, because in the past, it's been very extractive. Our knowledges have been taken away from us and put into different systems and manipulated. So there's also the intent that you need to understand that this knowledge is connected to the people, and it's connected to the language, and it's connected to the lands, and it can't just simply be extracted. So we need to be at the table assisting with making decisions so that we all have the healthy waters. I think also too that we look at all of these great people up here on the slide and thinking about the work that the IJC does and how it recognizes the importance of Indigenous knowledges and the importance of building those relationships and trust with Indigenous peoples. And in the IJC's last TAP report, which was published in 2023, the Commission found that engaging with First Nations, Métis, and tribal governments in the Great Lakes Basin is key to achieving the goals of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. The report acknowledges the efforts by both Canada and the US to collaborate with Indigenous peoples on water quality issues. And one of the recommendations centered on continuing efforts to invite and make space for Indigenous voices and Indigenous knowledge systems. Resilience depends not only on robust Western science, but also on governance that honors Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous rights. Enhancing the role of Indigenous peoples in collaborative governance is a strategic priority for the Commission. This is our priority across our transboundary responsibilities and our mandates. And to that end, IJC has recently established what is being coined right now as an Indigenous Circle of Experts. This circle is made up of Indigenous experts from a wide range of backgrounds and different nations, because we are not all the same. They will provide us with advice on better ways, on ways we can work better with Indigenous peoples, with their knowledge, and it's going to be centered on reciprocity, respect, relevance, and responsibility. The circle was inaugurated and had its first face-to-face meeting in October of last year. And the IJC is also working to increase the representation of Indigenous peoples on its advisory boards across the transboundary, including the Great Lakes. The Indigenous peoples on these boards help to shape the recommendations and solutions the IJC presents to governments. By increasing Indigenous peoples on our boards, the IJC seeks to enhance the voices of Indigenous peoples and work with Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems. The IJC has also undertaken efforts to enhance relationships with Indigenous nations across the Great Lakes, and the IJC has benefited greatly from the work of 3 early career fellows, because they have given, there was a talk, they were giving a talk earlier in a session, and because we have so many important sessions running back to back and side by side, the session is available. It's been recorded, but they provided a presentation on the lessons that they learned from dozens of face-to-face meetings they convened with Indigenous peoples across the basin. And remembering that water quality is just as important to Indigenous peoples as everyone else. It's not, it is actually everybody's responsibility to protect the waters. It's not just Indigenous people's responsibilities to do this. The Great Lakes has this science plan for the next generation, led by the Science Advisory Board. And it's supposed to include Indigenous knowledge. And there are actually workshops that are going to be happening this afternoon that will feed into the Commissioner's next TAP report, which we expect to be releasing in 2026. So if you wish to know more about the IJC's work, we have, we're on all the social media platforms. We have newsletters that you can subscribe to. We encourage you to check out our booth that is out there somewhere. And using the QR code here, or at our sponsor booth, you can sign up for the Commissioner's quarterly newsletter called Shared Waters. And through the newsletter, you can find more information about the IJC's current and ongoing work across the transboundary and opportunities to get involved. You can follow the IJC on all of these social media platforms, and you can speak to any of our IJC staff who are at the conference this week. And if our Great Lake Fellows and our IJC staff could please raise their hands so that people can come and talk to you, I would appreciate it. I know there's a table of them over there, but I can't see very well out there. So yeah, feel free to approach these very knowledgeable people if you have any questions. But before I wrap up today, I'd like to challenge you. It was really interesting when I was doing my PhD, somebody told me that I could make up words, and I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. So I'm going to make up this word, and it's not even making it up. I'm just changing this word called radical. I challenge you to be radical. It's a call to action to begin to reconcile or restore your relationship to the waters that you're from. Because everyone has a water story, and I've seen in other presentations, they've asked, what is your water story? Share your water story. We all love to hear stories. And how do you protect the waters? How do you do that as an individual? What is your responsibility to do? Yes, we all work in these great organizations that are protecting the waters, but what do we do individually to protect the waters? And I also encourage you to listen to Indigenous peoples. Our ways of knowing, seeing, relating, and being, our Indigenous knowledge systems, Giken Das Widmin, has sustained us successfully for thousands of years. Just look at the canoe. Where did that come from? Us. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a lot of knowledge that we've contributed. And I think that, thinking about the mayor's words about sticking together, thinking about the water, let's act like the water, let's be the H2Os with that amazing covalent bond. We can all do that. And when I talk about listening, I talk about it in a different sense, and I try to teach my students this because we were trained through the academic institutions to be thinking all the time. And so when we're listening to a lecture, we're thinking about, what is the question about this? What are we going to ask about this? How does this fit into here? And our brains are always going 100 miles an hour. So I challenge you to learn to listen in a different way. And that means pretty much trying to shut off your brain and listening with our hearts. And this is a quote from one of my favorite authors, Richard Wagamese. He says, "Me, you always repeat things 3 times. Old woman, just the important things. Me, why? I hear the first time. Old woman, no. You listen the first time, you hear the second time, and you feel the third time. Me, I don't get it. Old woman, when you listen, you become aware. That's for your head. When you hear, you awaken, and that's for your heart. When you feel, it becomes a part of you, and that's for your spirit. 3 times. It's so you learn to listen with your whole entire being, and that's how you learn. And lastly, if you're going to conduct research with Indigenous peoples, ask yourself a couple questions. Is this research driven by Indigenous peoples and for Indigenous peoples? I also want to challenge you today. Can you put your hand up if any of you came and attended an Indigenous session? I can't see how many people are putting their hands up, but there's some really good news, because if you weren't able to attend because there's so many amazing sessions happening, you still have a chance to be able to go back and look at those sessions. So I encourage you to review the program and find any of the sessions that are happening in the next couple days, but also to be able to go back and review those sessions and hear what the Indigenous peoples have been saying. I was at them, I'm telling you, they were just absolutely amazing. And this will give you an opportunity to learn more, because as human beings, we want to know stuff, right? We want to be able to have good conversations. And in order to do that, there are some of the older people that have said, do your homework. Do a little bit of homework. While you're driving, listen to a podcast. There's hundreds of ways that we can do this. So I want to say miigwech and thank you. But I did mention at the beginning that I would put up some suggestions for reading. And these are just some of my favorite authors, and they're actually all Indigenous. So because there are a lot of Indigenous people that have written about us, but these people are Indigenous and have written about us. So thank you very much for having me. I hope I know you are all still awake because it's pretty cold in here. And I'll take any questions. I think we have time. I'm going to look to my colleague over there to see if we have any time to take any questions. And I'll just leave this last slide up for you if anybody wants to take some photos of it.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Chiblow. I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it was such a nice balance. The talk we had yesterday was really hard science, and what we're seeing today is the kind of getting into the second and third way of knowing that you're talking about and learning with the heart. And I think it's, if we think about water in the Great Lakes and how we value them, it's not always from a strictly scientific or even an economic perspective, but often in an intangible way. Jerome has a microphone, so if anyone has a question, please put your hand up and Jerome will come to you with the microphone.
Jerome said I had good water up here, and he's right. It does taste really good. Thank you, Jerome. I think everybody's frozen.
What are some of the differences that you see between the different Indigenous peoples in the way that they view water as part of their identity?
We have, I think it's global. There are numerous water declarations that are out there by Indigenous peoples. And so there are core principles such as we understand that without water, there'll be no life. And I think that it's not just Indigenous peoples that understand that. But some of the core differences is our approach to the water. There's actually a book out there. It's called Water Voices of the World. And it's a big book, like it's bigger than 8.5 by 11. And it has a lot of photos in it. And it has letters to the author, Mark Williams, about the waters all over the world. And it actually talks about, in these letters, they talk about how they approach water or how they acknowledge or how they even conduct water ceremonies. And it's everywhere. And I encourage my students in our first class to try and find out who their ancestors are. Where did they come from? And to acknowledge that and to understand that, at some point in time in the past, they too would have had ceremonies and a way of approaching knowledge, approaching water and knowledge for the water. And so encouraging them to understand that we are all part of that. It's just some of us may walk, and we've seen Jerome running, so some of us may run, but we all have and understand that we are part of that water cycle, because if water totally just evaporated and left this planet, we'd be in big trouble. But if we evaporated and totally left this planet, water would be totally fine. So thinking about flipping that narrative and who needs who. We need the water more than the water needs us. Thank you much for the question.
Any other question?
You very much for the presentation. I had one comment and one question. The reading list that you had, I thought was great, and you mentioned podcasts, so I just wanted to elevate one resource. The podcast is called the Leadership Exchange Podcast, and it has really great case studies from the Wampanoag tribe of Gehedequina on Martha's Vineyard, direct conversations with elders, tribal members, tribal staff about trust responsibility, natural resources, and climate change. So just wanted to put that out there, and it ties to the question, which is how have you engaged tribes across the country and other parts of the country, if you have, and if so, how on these issues related to water resources?
Yeah, a great question, and thank you for that plug. One of the things I always remind people is I'm Anishinaabe, so I don't research Anishinaabe people because I am them. the work that I do is driven by the elders. I'm just their tool because I have those 3 letters behind my name, that I have a set of unique skills now that help them get where they want to go. So it goes back to a matter of, I have a research program that is driven for and by the elders. I had elders gatherings where they said, this is what we want to do, and then they prioritized it, and so that's what I've been doing. And because I always say that I'm very fortunate, because when I worked for the Chiefs of Ontario, I was able to work all over Ontario and even beyond and meet different Indigenous nations. So people kind of know who I am. And so when I approach them and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this work on water, would you guys be interested? It's coming from the Robinson Huron Wawalindigogdamin. And would you be interested? You want to meet with our elders? And so those things roll into place for me. Right now, I'm on 3 different projects, but one of the well, they're all important, but the one with the biggest bucket of money is investigating chemical management with Indigenous expertise. And this stems from the elders being concerned with the use of herbicide spraying and forestry operations in our territory and how that's affecting the ecosystem. And so this is what they want me to do. So this is part of a grant that I've been successful with Ganilla and Murphy to do that work. So this is why I had asked in the beginning, or I had mentioned that, to ask yourself, if you're going to do research with Indigenous peoples, and I use that word purposely, with Indigenous peoples, to ask yourself if that is actually being driven by them, if it's what they want done. And because we can really, if we talk about water quantity and quality, well, we all want good, clean, healthy water. We look at the Great Lakes water quality and it says drinkable, swimmable, fishable. The Great Lakes have fish advisory consumption guidelines. And the last time I checked, which was a couple years ago, so hopefully maybe it changed, I got my fingers crossed, but women of childbearing age are not supposed to eat any fish out of the Great Lakes. That's a huge population of people that are not supposed to be eating any fish. So what are we doing? And we love fish as Indigenous peoples. That was one of our primary staples of food. And now we're not supposed to eat it anymore. So I think that there's understanding that there is so many commonalities that we have already in place, and focusing on those commonalities and having those discussions and building those relationships is just going to enhance and make the research even that much more valuable, and more valuable than just walking in with extracting knowledge and taking off. And of course, that's merely my educated opinion, so other people might have other opinions. Miigwech for the question.
We have a question online from Kevin Rath.
Sure.
He says, please remind us, who was the author of the quotes that you shared with us regarding listening?
Yeah, that was the quote I shared. Comes from Richard Waugamies's book. It's called Embers with an E, and it is Embers Anishinaabeg Reflections. So it's a really nice book. It has different types of reflections all through the book, and this is even on the screen right now for India. For example, we're looking at Basil Johnson. Basil Johnson is not a scholar in the way that we know what a scholar is, that you have to go through the Western education systems. But he's been writing amazing books for such a long time, and they are very thought-provoking. So I also, with Richard, he's now since passed, but he's also not a scholar, but he's been writing amazing books. for a very long time, and I love with a lot of humor, because we all need to laugh once in a while when we know we can't eat no fish out of the Great Lakes. Just saying. Over there. Back there.
One last question.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask if you could talk about the word radical a little bit more.
Yeah. I use, you know what, let me see if I can go back. Oh, look at that. Okay, so I used each letter when we talk about the R to restore respect, responsibilities, relationships to the water, which is all about reconciliation, right? But also, excuse me, to honor the knowledges that we have, to heal our relationships, to work together, and to ensure that we have healthy waters. But also, everybody has a heart, so we all have heart knowledge, to also rely on that, and to defend the water, to decolonize our way of thinking, so actually to shift the paradigm and think about what if we could understand what the water, if water could speak the English language, what would it say to us if we were standing on the shore? What would it say? What would the water say? So to decolonize our thinking and try to think in a different way, but to understand that we are all interconnected and interrelated to water. And that again, we go back to, we all have ceremonies for the water. Everybody does. And we don't have to steal each other's ceremonies. We can just participate in them and do our own ceremonies. And a lot of the elders that I've worked with have said there is no wrong way to say thank you to the water. And to be collaborative. We talk about co-creation, but collaboration is foundational to co-creation. And it's great when we have all of these beautiful words that we use, like resilience, but what are our actions? What is my individual action that I'm going to do? And how am I accountable to those waters? How am I accountable to the past, the ancestors who have carried that knowledge forward and have gifted me with that knowledge? And how am I going to carry that forward? And then to be an advocate on behalf of the water, to listen to the water, to understand that water is life, but also to love the water. And that sounds like all corny and stuff, but you know what? When Jerome told me I had good water up here, I was like, ooh, city water is kind of, I don't live on city water. I live on well water, and it tastes so good. And when I go to the city and take a drink, I'm like, oh, geez, what did they do to that water? So I'm always really cautious about that. And I'm telling you, I really love good tasting water. So there are ways that we can express that, and it doesn't have to be, we don't have to turn it into something that feels uncomfortable. And we can do this by ourselves. We can do it with our family. We can do it with everybody. You know, as Indigenous peoples, especially as Anishinaabe peoples, I can only speak for them because that's who I am. We are a very kind people. When we are doing ceremonies, everybody is welcome. When we're doing presentations, everybody is welcome. We never exclude anybody. And we learn these things, and when we talk about learning from the lands, let's just think about a forest. It has birch, maple, spruce, pine trees. You don't see the pine trees telling the birch trees to get the heck out of the bush. It's inclusive. They work together. And guess what? Scientists have discovered that there's a whole underground system on how they communicate with one another. So all of this is there. And that is all part of working together, looking at how all of these trees collaborate together and ensure that they're all surviving. Even if the pine produces leaves, the pine needles are more acidic than the maple trees, they're still there, working beside one another, living together. So there are many things that we can do if we sit down and we listen in a different way, and we listen to life, and just acknowledge and appreciate that. A lot of those lessons come from there, not just from us. I hope that's helpful. Miigwech. I'm in between your lunch, and so we're going to wrap up.
Thank you. It was very enjoyable. Thank you, Susan. We've listened to you, we hear you, and hopefully we will also feel what you have said.